Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and we will be picking we will be picking right back up where we left off. We left off with our analysis of the Civil War. We did an analysis of the battles, and then we also did an analysis of the Civil War, its impact, and its enduring legacy over our last four lectures. With this lecture, we are going to continue our narrative in U.S. history. We're going to move beyond the Civil War and look at the period directly following Civil War, the period known as Reconstruction. Now, before we begin our lectures on Reconstruction, and we will do about 8 lectures covering the Reconstruction time frame, we'll look at the struggles between the president and Congress, the presidents Lincoln and Johnson. We'll look at what Congress did. We'll examine the scene as it was in the former slave states as Reconstruction was unfolding, and we'll also look at the very controversial way in which Reconstruction ended. But before we begin our lectures on Reconstruction, I would like to just do a quick recap on and touch bases really on what we last discussed in our last narrative lecture on U.S. history before we delved into our analysis of the battles and the overall enduring legacy of the United States Civil War. So, where we last left off was the end campaign, the final push for the United States to finally defeat the Confederate States. We last talked of Lincoln's assassination, how that plunged the nation into mourning, how it sort of really set the stage for the Reconstruction narrative that we all know today. We talked of Grant's great plan, his great push, and the failures and successes that plan experienced. Most notably, Sherman's march to the sea was stymied very early on. However, he was able to, with a bit of luck, a incompetent Confederate commander was placed in command of the forces opposing him. That commander gave battle to Sherman. Sherman defeated him in battle and went on to capture Atlanta and continue his very destructive but decisive march to the sea. That saw the widespread destruction of some of the most fertile and just best growing croplands in the deep slave states. It also saw Sherman make the sort of on-hand decision to just grant land, some of the best, the most fertile agricultural land to freedmen, has the means of getting them to leave his army alone and not follow him on his military progress. And with that being said, I'd like to dive right into our lectures. Now, the end of the war did not end the bitterness between the two sections. There was a lot at stake in the old slave states. Would freemen be given political rights? Would the returning states have to undergo any major changes? Another question was who was going to be in charge of these slave states. Was this going to be an executive process under the president, a legislative process under the Congress? Was there going to be was this going to be a moderate, conservative, or radical experience? Now, also, would the Democratic Party play any role in this process? Between 1865 and 1877, the United States embarked on one of the greatest social transformations in human history. Reconstruction, or the Second American Revolution, as some call it, was a period in which the ideas to the Revolution of 1776 were nearly fulfilled in the Republic. This period saw the complete transformation of the former slave states economically, socially, and politically. Many post-war concerns were addressed, namely the reintegration of the former rebel slave states, the punishment and reformation of the former rebel combatants, political battle between the legislative and the executive branches of the federal government, and the emerging attempts of the African American community to integrate itself into national and regional United States society. The changes between the war years were astonishing. The entire slave population had been freed from bondage. Chief Justice Taney's ruling in the Dred Scott decision was overturned by the Civil Rights Amendments, and African Americans now had achieved the same legal rights and protections as their European American counterparts, in addition to political equality via enfranchisement. Now, Reconstruction would have been impossible without the United States Civil War, which wrought cataclysmic change on the United States, namely on the slave states, through the emancipation of their slave population. Have we discussed in earlier in earlier lectures, emancipation was not a singular event, but a manifestation of individual events, from the advancement of the United States armies to slaves seizing the moment when they felt that their masters or social agents could not prevent them from escaping. The first event of the latter occurred on the Sea Islands of the the Sea Islands off the coast of the South Carolina and Georgia mainlands. With the rapid flight of the slavocrats to the mainland, slave owners soon found that they could not compel the majority of their slaves to follow them. Thus, the game changed. The social change was not just limited to freeing oneself. The freedmen, as the former slaves were addressed, set about rectifying their personal life by legitimizing slave marriages with the aid of local preachers, discarding slave names and adopting names like freedmen, or ones that corresponded to their trade. The freedmen also physically relocated themselves from the plantation Slave Row. Slave Row was the name given to the housing section, the housing quarter on a plantation for slaves. They relocated to the far reaches of the plantation grounds. They also spaced out their homes for added privacy. Now, many more took to the road to relocate family members separated by the domestic slave trade, while others took to the road to simply enjoy being able to move about freely. For those who remained on the plantation, they shifted from producing the labor-intensive cash crops like cotton and sugarcane to foodstuffs to improve their own diets. They rejected gang labor and shifted to a more normalized, gender differential source of agriculture. The field and the manual labor systems that or differential that was prevalent in 19th century United States. While rejecting the large-scale production of cash crops, former slaves did they did engage in cultivating cotton to gain quick money. Now, the cash was used to obtain the material goods often denied to slaves, like adequate clothing and also just walking about to areas that have really just been previously prohibited to them. Most disturbing of all was the change in social interaction with former masters, who had long been accustomed to a deference from the African American populations, be they free or slave. They were in complete shock of their behavior. They experienced a lack of respect from the freedmen, and they also felt they deserved the fashionable adornments that the freedmen acquired. They felt that the freedmen didn't show them the deference that they had showed them when they were enslaved, and they found that the freedmen bought the same type of clothing that they themselves bought, the same sort of fashionable garments that were once exclusively for slavocrats or middling European Americans were now available to everybody, and the freedmen, when they had the cash on hand, they made the same purchases. Now, the Sea Islands had the great distinction of being where the first steps towards both emancipation and Reconstruction occurred. They proved to be the rehearsal grounds for Reconstruction. On the Sea Islands, abolitionist groups, along with freedmen, established churches, schools, and they did it primarily in an effort to create a small landowning agrarian community. much like Jefferson's dream of an agrarian republic. Now, to achieve that, communities of freedmen pooled their resources, bought land that was auctioned off by the federal government. At the same time, financial investors from the free states also bought large amounts of land. Indeed, the investor from the free states, they did so to resume the very profitable cotton trade. Now, the operations of both groups ran counter to each other's. The freedmen were reluctant to work for others and produce cash crops on a massive scale. They instead preferred to simply engage in subsistence farming. When the freedmen did show interest in cultivating cash crops, the two groups could not come together on wages. Now, while events in the Sea Island were unfolding, things in Louisiana were heating up. Large portions of Louisiana were occupied very early on. And like the Sea Islands, they saw the arrival of a number of abolitionists who set about assisting the freedmen in creating a self-sufficient community with schools and churches and access to land to support themselves. Now, their plans would be upended, that is sort of checked by Nathaniel Banks. Banks made an arrangement early on with the local former slave owners, whereby he would assure the availability of the freedmen for 1-year contracts if they were given wages, access to food, clothing, and not physically abused. Now, while the Sea Islands and Louisiana Reconstruction rehearsals were taking place, Congress was fracturing between various groups. The Democratic Party offered stiff resistance to any change in the pre-war relationships among the slave ships, the slave state communities, and two factions arose in the Republican Party that contested one another for control of the direction and the aims of Reconstruction. The moderate Republicans championed the restoration of European American. Excuse me. The moderate Republicans championed the restoration of the European American rights and the property with limited gain for African Americans, while radical Republicans advocated for harsher punishments for former rebels and a broad increase in the rights for freedmen. Now, Congress, while fractured, did set about addressing the issues confronting healing the Republic. In March of 1865, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands was established, known as the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, this federal agency was tasked with clothing, feeding, and overseeing contracts between freedmen and Confederate refugees. Now, the Bureau had success by the war's end. Nearly 10,000 refugees and freedmen families were resettled on land seized in Georgia and South Carolina. And we'll break here in our lecture series, and we'll resume with part 2 of our lecture series of our lectures on Reconstruction. And as always, I'm Ted. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know specifically what you thought about this lecture on Reconstruction. It's a very controversial period in American history. A lot of advocates and a lot of detractors for it. But regardless, I'd like to know what you thought about the information presented. And I'll see you guys next time for another lecture.